It's 9:30. And where did we end up last week? End of chapter 9. And in some of your versions, the last word in chapter 9 is disqualified. Paul was talking about himself. He wanted to run the race to the end. He said, unless I have preached to others and I myself be disqualified. That same thought is carried over into chapter 10. And we talk about chapter divisions. I mean, Paul didn't write them that way. He didn't even write them with verses. That got put in maybe in the 1500s, where you got the chapters and verses. The break is probably in the wrong place, because if you look at your first word of chapter 10, in the NIV, it is for. In the New King James, it is moreover. Not sure about the Old King James, but it's connecting the two. This is a continuation of the thought of being, perhaps, disqualified. And then he talks about a blessed people who failed. He's talking about Israel, a people that had been baptized into Moses. Let's look at the first two verses. I'm in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all of our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. The cloud that led them while they were in the wilderness, led them by the day. Then, of course, by the night, you had that fire that was above them, that led them. And as they left Egypt, they passed through the sea. When God parted the waters on one side and on the other side, and they walked down the middle on dry land. The Egyptians were close behind. The Egyptians thought, well, they did it. It was a bad idea. Because after Israel had gotten through and the Egyptians were partway in, God closed the waters back up. The Egyptians were drowned. And so in the water, Israel was surrounded by water. In the cloud, the cloud was over them. This is a type. It's not reality in the sense that we would compare it to baptism, because when Israel went through the sea, they didn't get wet. Their feet may have gotten muddy, but they did not get wet because the water was to the sides. The same way with the cloud. Now, the word that is used here in verse 2 is the typical Greek word baptizo that we transliterate into baptism. They were baptized into Moses. We are baptized into Christ. There's a difference. They were baptized into Moses as their leader. He led them. We are baptized into Christ as our Savior. Hugely different. And the New Bible Commentary addressing this verse says that this passage through the water brought the people under the authority of Moses. He was the mediator of the new covenant, and it brought them under his authority. But there's a teaching here for us. And maybe the teaching is that despite their baptism, they failed. And I fear that there are some followers of Christ today, I'm almost using followers in quotation marks, that they look upon baptism as almost like a magic bullet, a get-out-of-jail-free card, as you used to have in that old game of Monopoly. I played Monopoly when I was growing up, but I bet some of you haven't even heard of the game. Probably not so much now. But they had a get-out-of-jail-free card. I hope we don't view baptism that way. Our baptism is critical, but it will not get us into heaven by itself. No way. Observing the Lord's Supper is important. But just the fact that we are baptized and we partake of the Lord's Supper regularly is not going to put us into heaven if our lives don't reflect it. If we are not striving to follow Jesus, the fact that we have gotten wet in a baptistry isn't going to do much good. It is essential, but it's the starting point. And Burton Kaufman, in his commentary on this passage, said that there were some people in Corinth who may have believed that the fact that they had been baptized and that they participated regularly in the Lord's Supper freed them to also participate in the feast with their idolatrous neighbors. That may or may not be. But it is very clear that obedience involves more than just being baptized. These people had been baptized into Moses, but God was not pleased with them. These people, as you go on, were fed from heaven, verse 3, with supernatural food. We remember what it was. It was manna. And it appeared on the ground 6 days a week, just like frost. It actually sounded like it was sort of a thin, crisp, sweet bread. Sounds pretty good to eat. And they ate it. And they ate it for 40 years. Now, I'm sure they ate some other things too. But if they didn't have anything else, they ate the manna. It was always there. And God provided it. But it was not the true bread from heaven. Manna, I think, actually means angel food. That reminds me of angel food cake. I'm not real thrilled with angel food cake. I think manna would have been better. I like things that are hard. Nancy will say that. When she makes cookies, she always kind of burns a few of them for me, because when they crunch, I like them. Manna may have crunch, but angel food cake doesn't. It's just kind of gummy. Turn over to John chapter 6. John 6. Here Jesus is talking about the true bread, starting in verse 31. Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. That was the manna. Then Jesus said to them, Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven. My Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Who is Jesus talking about? Himself. Comes down from heaven, gives life to the world, the true manna. So they had supernatural food. Verse 4, they had the same spiritual drink. Water. which God made accessible to them all the time during that wandering. It took a lot of water to nourish those hundreds of thousands of people every day. But they would find it. And on 2 occasions, when there wasn't water available, God made it available to them. It flowed out of a rock. You remember those stories. One time Moses did what God said, strike the rock. This was the first time, Exodus chapter 17. Struck the rock, the water came out. Second time, God told Moses to speak to the rock. And to some degree, Moses tried to take the credit to himself when he addresses the people and says, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we," joining himself with God, "bring forth water to you from this rock?" He struck it. Well, number one, God said, speak to it. He didn't do that. And he didn't give God the full credit. What happened to Moses as a result? Couldn't enter the promised land. Severe consequences for a moment of rashness. We've all seen that happen. We've probably seen it happen to ourselves. When we did something rashly and then look back and say, why did I do that? Probably Moses did that. Why did I do that? But it cost him. It cost him dearly. And that rock followed them, a spiritual rock, with them during the whole wanderings. So they were a blessed people, the apple of God's eye. They were fed, they were watered supernaturally, but still they displeased God. Look at verse 5. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Why was that? It was because of sin. Sin and unbelief, which is sin, started there in this reference with the spies who went into the promised land, and they came back and they reported. All of them agreed, boy, it is a great place. 10 of them said, oh, but the people there are big and there's just no way. I mean, they would just beat us to a pulp. Joshua and Caleb said, oh no, God will be with us and we can do it. The people believed the 10, not the 2. They turned against Joshua and Caleb. They turned against Moses. They were rebelling against God. And their proposition, let's choose a leader to take us back to Egypt. We may have been slaves, but at least we had something to eat. We don't want to be out here anymore. Moses pleaded with them. This is in Numbers chapter 14, verse 6. Don't do this. Don't rebel against God. They wouldn't hear it. And so Moses pleaded with God not to strike them dead just right then. And he didn't. But there were consequences, dreadful consequences. We see in this verse 5, that all of them had received those blessings. Most of them were going to fall. Who were the most? Well, it was everybody who was over 20 years old, except for Joshua and Caleb. God said, all the rest who are over 20 will die in the wilderness. And your children, who you said will die out here, are going to be the ones to enter the promised land. And you won't. because of unbelief. No, verse 32, Numbers 14. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness. That's what God told Moses to say to the people. And he did. And then the people were sorry. And they said, well, let's go up and do it. We can take the land. And Moses said, no. In effect, you've made your bed. Now you're going to lie in it. They had already decided otherwise. God was going to leave them with their decision. And there is a reminder there to us that you see in Jude, verse 5, that God delivered the people out of Egypt and then destroyed them in the wilderness. He destroyed them because of unbelief. And there are warnings in these verses as we continue down through verse 13. Warnings to us. Paul was giving warnings to the people of his day. They are just as applicable to us almost 2,000 years later. Warnings against various sins, starting with idolatry in verse 7. Don't become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. My understanding of the word play is that they were not playing Ring Around the Rosie. It more has reference to sexual immorality. When did they do that? It's while Moses was up on the mountain, receiving the commandments from God. And he had been gone a while. And the people said to Aaron, we don't know what's happened to Moses. So you make gods for us, just like we had in Egypt. Well, in Egypt, cows were venerated. So Aaron made the golden calf. That's what he's talking about in verse 7. Idolatry. And that tendency toward idolatry was always present in Israel, and then as the kingdoms divided, both in the north and the south. Sometimes it was kept down. Sometimes it fully flowered, particularly in the northern kingdom. Always a tendency to it. We don't worship literal, physical, tangible false gods today. In parts of the world they do. Not generally in this country, although there may be some that do. But what is an idol? Anything put before the true God. That's what an idol is. How many of us know people who do that? Some of them may be members of this church who put other things before God. That's idolatry. Maybe not in the same sense as here, but still idolatry. There's a warning against immorality. Well, that was also tied into the idolatry. But it's specific in verse 8. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 fell. Paul is referring to a specific event when some of the Israelites went after women from Moab. Look in Numbers chapter 25. This is the event that Paul is talking about. Numbers 25, verses 1 to 3. Then Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So this first they is the Moabites. The people is Israel. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. And you have an event described in which a Israelite man and a Midianite woman were engaged in sexual intercourse, and Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, killed both of them. He skewered them in one spear stroke, killed them both. And thousands were then killed by a plague, verse 9. Sexual immorality. And of course, that temptation to immorality was common in Corinth. There actually was a verb form, to Corinthianize. And when someone used the expression to Corinthianize, they knew what it meant. To be wild sexually. That was the meaning of it, which is a common expression. And so back in chapter 6 and verse 18, Paul warned the people, flee fornication. It is everywhere around you in this city. Run away from it. Because if not, you'll be entrapped by it. Most of us probably have done a pretty good job of fleeing fornication. But it's hard to go to movies or even to watch a lot of TV without seeing lots of sexual immorality on it. And even if you don't see the immorality, you still see a lot of skin, and all of that skin can lead to immorality. Run from it. And I'm sure he's talking about literal immorality here, literal fornication. But he could also be talking about spiritual fornication, turning from God. There was an example, a whole book in the Old Testament, the book of Hosea. And Gomer, Hosea's wife, unfaithful to him. And that was used as an illustration of the unfaithfulness of the people of Israel. Flee from immorality. Don't test God. Look at verse 9. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. You remember that story. It's in Numbers chapter 21. Lots of the events of the wilderness wandering are described in the book of Numbers. Leviticus dealt most with the priests, Deuteronomy with the law, Numbers with the events. That's where you find them. And you remember the serpents that God sent, and they bit the people, and a lot of people died. What brought that on? It was complaining. At the beginning of Numbers chapter 21, the people complain about being in the wilderness, about their general privation. They didn't have all the luxuries they would have liked. And in particular, what did they complain about? The bread from heaven, the manna. We loathe this food. It's like having macaroni and spaghetti every day for 4 months. You may like macaroni and spaghetti. I do. We're going to have it for lunch. It's already in the oven. But every day for 4 months, every day for 40 years, we loathe this food. And so God sent serpents. The Greek word that is used here in verse 9 for tempting or testing implies that it was prolonged. It wasn't just a one-timer. And we know throughout the wanderings in the wilderness that they often complained. And God dealt with them. Because God has great patience. Had it then, He has it now. But it has its limits. And at times with Israel, it met its limit. Ron?
Can we still test God today?
Sir?
Can we
test God today? I think we definitely can. And we don't know how God may react. God may just leave it to the end and then say, you rejected me, you tested me, you tried me, I reject you. He may do that. He may also cause bad things to happen. God can do what God wants to do. And I don't necessarily believe that all of the results of sin happen in eternity. Some of them happen now. Frequently when people have auto wrecks that kill them, they've either been disobeying the traffic laws, or they've been drinking and they're impaired, or both. Bad conduct, sinful conduct, leading to a bad event right then for them. Can we test God today? I think we absolutely can. And when Israel kept tempting, kept trying, kept pushing back against God, there's an indication there of a lack of repentance. We may be sorry today, but 3 days from now we'll do it again because we haven't changed our conduct. Testing God. They also complain, verse 10. Nor murmur, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed by the destroyer. Complaining. Kind of part and parcel with testing. So we've seen it in some of these other scriptures. Complaining, a common failing. Goes all the way back to Eden. When Satan tempted Eve, she ate of the fruit. She gave some to Adam. He ate of the fruit. God confronts them. What does Adam say? It was this woman. You gave me this woman. You did it. God, you're kind of at fault. Because if it hadn't been for you making the woman, this wouldn't have happened. So I go back to you as the primary fault and her as the secondary fault. He blames them both. Complaining. It's been around since the beginning. It is still with us. Complaining and blaming other people for things that happened to us. It's not my fault. I mean, when Flip Wilson, I think that's who it was, said the devil made me do it, people laughed because he was funny. They were supposed to laugh. But the idea of blaming others is always around. And whenever things go wrong, you'll always find somebody who will say, well, it's not my fault. Because if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have done it. So that, whatever it is the problem. Well, they were destroyed by the destroyer. And I'm not sure what specific event Paul is referring to here, but there are several instances of that. Remember the destroyer who passed through Egypt. Now, he wasn't killing Israelites, he was killing Egyptians. And some people call that the death angel. Well, in Exodus chapter 12, it wasn't the death angel, it was the Lord. The Lord was passing through Egypt, looking for that blood over the doorpost. You do have an angel of the Lord, though. I think we could call him the death angel. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, David had it in his mind. He had a big army. So he sends Joab, his general, out to number the warriors. Let's see how many we've got. Joab knew that was a bad idea. He tried to convince David it was a bad idea. David didn't listen. He did it anyway. An angel of the Lord killed many, many people and was preparing to come against Jerusalem. And David pleaded with God not to do that. It is my fault. He took the blame. It's not these people's fault. It's my fault. And as Paul is listing these, we can see that complaining, which we might regard as just a little foible that we do sometimes, it's serious. And that's why Paul wrote elsewhere, Philippians 2 and verse 14, do all things without grumbling or complaining. A warning. Because he's illustrating here what can happen when we continually grumble, when we complain. There's a warning here against those specific sins. There is also a warning against failing to learn from the past. Look at verse 11. Now, all of these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, on whom the ends of the ages have come. There is a very similar passage in Romans 15 and verse 4. Whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. You've heard the saying, great truth. Those who fail to learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. Is that in the Bible in so many words? No. Is it in the Bible in 1 Corinthians 10:11 and Romans 15:4? The theme of it is yes. Who said it? Georges Santayana. He was a Spanish-American writer, born in 1863, around the time of the Gettysburg Address. Died in 1952. And we people who live in the New Testament age need to learn from the Old Testament. Because these things, as Paul said, are given to us as an example. And so we can ask, why do so many Christians consider the Old Testament as unimportant? Now, it is certainly true that we don't read how to be saved in the Old Testament. That's true. We read it in the New. It is also true that the Old Testament is the Word of God, and that the Old Testament is about 3 times as long as the New Testament. Now, does that mean that we should spend 75% of our time in the Old Testament? Probably not. But does it mean that we should spend 1% of our time in the Old Testament? No, it doesn't. There needs to be the proper balance. David Lipscomb wrote about the Old Testament. No man can have a clear knowledge of how God will apply his law without studying the lessons he has given in the Old Testament scriptures. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And God sometimes dealt harshly with sin in the Old Testament. And immediately. He may not deal immediately. We bring temptations on ourselves. And when we are tempted, That's not sin. Remember the old song, yield not to temptation, for yielding is sin. That's where the sin is. We will all be tempted. Not sin in itself. When we give into it, that's when it is. And don't our life experiences show us that God can help us resist temptation? I'm sure they do. We've all seen that. And it gets easier the longer that we've been Christians. We've seen that. God doesn't tempt us, but He lets us be tried. He lets things happen because they can make us stronger. Hinted at here in verse 13. Think about Abraham. The command, boy, that was out of the blue and it made no sense, to sacrifice your son. But he was willing to do it, and God stopped him. God will provide a way of escape. And so verse 13 here may be addressed to those who were fearful. Those who were afraid, I'm not standing, I'm falling. But they were trying, and God would help them. And so he ends the chapter on a positive note. He will provide a way of escape. Now, will the way of escape always being what we might hope it to be? Probably not. For many of the Christians in the early days of the church, the escape was death. There are believers in Afghanistan who died in the last week. Their escape was death. But still, it is an escape. And there will be a way of escape in every trial, even if the escape itself seems bad at the time. That's the first 13 verses connected to the previous chapter about being disqualified, like happened to Israel. And next week, we will finish up chapter 10.